Tiki Bugger.
Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Simon and I'm the host of Simple Dad, Happy Parent. I'm a single dad of one on a journey of parenting discovery. This podcast is for parents and families wanting simple solutions and techniques to help in the development of their children. In my weekly podcast, I dive into the most important child development research and speak with some of the most influential doctors, scientists and authors in the parenting space, all to help us build and develop our own parenting toolkits, all to help our children grow and develop to reach their full potential and live happy, healthy lives. In today's podcast, I welcome Dr. Tim Sharp, Australia's very own Dr. Happy, who's at the forefront of positive psychology here in Australia. He's taught at all the major universities in New South Wales and is a best-selling author of a number of books, including The Happiness Handbook, 100 Ways to Happiness, a guide for busy people, and 100 Ways to Happy Children, a guide for busy parents. He's appeared in a number of national TV shows, and he is also the founder and chief happiness officer of the Happiness Institute, Australia's first and largest organisation devoted solely to enhancing happiness in individuals, families and organisations. Dr. Tim Sharp now has a brand new 10-part Audible series called Habits for Happy Children, which is jam-packed full of helpful tips from his years of research to help us build a positive, loving relationship with our children. So let's get straight into the chat I had with Dr. Tim Sharp. I'm really interested to know a bit about your background and how you started the Happiness Institute.
So I established Happiness Institute, it was 20 years ago now, in response to the birth of positive psychology. So I guess my background was in clinical and academic psychology. So it's traditional psychology, what most people think of. So my background as a therapist and academic and researcher was mostly about stress and depression and anxiety. And that's what most of psychology is about. And so it's about identifying that, assessing that, and treating people with those problems and a bunch of other stuff as well. But around the turn of the century, in the early 2000s, or actually probably in the very late 1990s, a number of psychologists started to ask. They said, for so long we've focused on what's wrong with people and how to fix it. What if we would actually focus on what's right with people and how to make the most of that? And to cut a long story short, that led to the development of a formal domain that came to be known as positive psychology, which and they're not mutually exclusive. So it's not about ignoring the stress and depression, anxiety, but what they said is, okay, we still, this is important. We need to identify that. We need to treat people with that, help them as best we can. But there's also a lot more we can do. And that by ignoring the positive side of life, by ignoring the positive emotions and thriving and flourishing, we psychologists are not, we're not doing as much or as well as we could do. So from that grew the positive psychology movement. I established the Happiness Institute as a way to focus on that and to, I guess, really to wave the flag. Because when I did that, no one else in Australia was really talking about it. So I wanted to start the conversation. And one way I did that was to develop, to establish the Happiness Institute as a positive psychology practice. So in very simple terms, it's about promoting the principles of positive psychology as widely as possible.
Yeah, wow. What a great accomplishment that is. Okay, so through your research and through your institute, how would you define happiness? I mean, obviously everyone has their own version of happiness, but how should we be approaching it?
So there are multiple definitions, and as you hinted at, it does differ for different people. So that's actually a really important point. It's kind of pretty obvious, but it is really important that my definition of happiness will be different to yours, because we're different people with different backgrounds and different goals and different beliefs, etc. So that is really important, and that's one of the most important things that I often advocate. That to be happy, we need to actively define our own version of happiness, because if we don't know what that is, we're never going to achieve it. And a lot of people don't. Most people don't even think enough about it. So, but to come back to the definitions, as I said, there are many different definitions. But in simple terms, you can kind of divide it or break it down to two. The simplest definition of happiness is as one form of positive emotion. So we know that from the research, there's a whole range of positive emotions, not just happiness, but there's also joy and satisfaction and calm and pride and excitement even. So there's a whole range of positive feelings, of which happiness is one. And that's the simplest way to define it. And that's the way that most people in general everyday life probably think about it. If I ask you how are you feeling, are you happy, you will probably think about those fleeting emotions. But that's what's important to take in mind there. With that definition, what we're talking about are fairly short-term, superficial emotions that come and go. They're still important. But what the second definition I think is probably more important, and this is what positive psychology is really focusing on, not just those fleeting positive emotions, which, as I said, are important. It's not about ignoring them, but positive psychology is more interested in a deeper underlying sense of life satisfaction, what we sometimes refer to as thriving and flourishing. So in that sense, what we're talking about is not just how you're feeling in this minute or in the next minute, but overall taking everything into account. How satisfied are you with your life overall? And as I said, that's a form of not just emotion, but it also takes into account, the meaning and purpose you have in your life. It takes into account your physical health and well-being, the quality of your relationship. So, these are bigger, deeper, and more meaningful constructs that go towards a bigger definition of happiness.
So if there's as going back to being a parent, if there's one thing we can do every day, what should we be doing?
Yeah, look, I guess I'll start. I want to qualify this by saying that I'm definitely not the perfect parent. And I think that's important because I think none of us are the perfect parent, and even people like myself who study and learn and live this every day, we still get it wrong. So the first thing I'd like to say is, as parents, we need to be careful of our expectations. And in fact, what I encourage people to think about is good enough parenting, which means you won't get it right. You won't get it right all the time. In fact, you'll get it wrong lots of the time. But as long as you get it right some of the time, or more often than not, as long as you're good enough, and so I say that by I'm happy to give some recommendations and say what the research recommends, but with the caveat that we're going to stuff up sometimes. But with that, if I had to say the most important thing, it's actually quite simple, because based on the research and based on a lot of experience, there really is one thing that's the most important thing parents can try to do as often as possible, and that is to love our kids. To love them as best we can, unconditionally, ideally not tying that to achievements or accomplishments. This is a very easy trap to fall into I think in our Western society. There's so much emphasis on, setting goals and, so like with kids, for example, getting good exam marks or getting good school marks or things like that. Now those things are not unimportant. They're not bad. Achieving well at school or on the sporting field or in any other, it's great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But ideally, we don't want to, if we tie our love for our children to those things, then they learn to only love themselves when they achieve. And that can be quite dangerous. That can lead to a fairly brittle, fragile form of self-love. Whereas in the ideal world, and this is much easier said than done, in fact, it's really hard to do well. In the ideal world, we should feel good about ourselves regardless of whether we've had a win or not, or even, dare I say it, even when we failed. In an ideal world, even when we fail, which we will do, we should still love ourselves and feel good about ourselves. And I guess that's what we want our kids to do. So to try to build that in our children, we need to display unconditional love as often as possible, to let them know that we care, that we value them, again, even when they stuff up. Now, I suppose that, that doesn't mean you're not going to get upset with your kids. It doesn't mean you won't need to, punish them or correct them at times. That's part of parenting. I mean, discipline is important, and discipline isn't incongruent with love. In fact, I would say, if we do love our kids, we will need to discipline them, because we'll need to teach them. That's part of teaching them, the important lessons that they need to learn, that we all need to learn. But you can discipline with love. You can correct your child to help them learn with love. And I think, again, that's, the research suggests, when we look at all the research and we look at those people who thrive and flourish in life, who are more successful and healthier and live longer, the most significant factor is they came from a home where they felt loved and cared for and supported.
And if we look at it more of a teaching experience than punishing, then you're on the right track.
Yeah. Well, definitely. So I'm not talking about physical punishment or corporal punishment. There's actually, there's a fairly simple answer to that because there's some very good research, and the research suggests it just doesn't work.
Yeah. And
negative punishment, getting angry, it really doesn't achieve what we want to achieve, which is to help them to learn the lesson. So now, again, we're all fallible as parents, and it's going to happen. You're going to yell at your kids. You're going to get angry. You're probably going to even smack them at times. Not that I would advocate that, but it's it's kind of a normal, particularly if you're worried about them, or if they're about to touch a hot stove, you might slap their hand away. But again, the research is very clear. Positively reinforcing desirable behaviours is far more effective than punishing negative behaviours. And that's, again, discipline is something different as well. Discipline is not just about punishing or rewarding. It's about teaching rules and teaching, structure, which we need in our lives and our kids need in their lives. And in fact, again, the research is clear. Kids actually function better with certain rules. Now, what that means is, they won't like that all the time, particularly, I guess, when they get to those tricky teenage years and, so having rules around, phone use, smartphone use or technology use, or just to give it, or gaming use. These are common sorts of challenging areas, or rules around socializing, etc. Kids won't always like that. But the other thing we need to remember as a parent is we're not here to be liked by our kids all the time. In fact, I would suggest that, particularly in the teenage years, if your kid loves you every minute of every day, you're probably not being a good parent.
I'm dreading
so we need to be prepared to kind of do the right thing, not necessarily the easiest thing or the thing that our kids will always agree with.
Okay, so from that, how do we approach teaching our children?
Well, the best way to teach anything as a parent, and anything really, is to model it. Is to model those behaviours. The best way to teach your kids to love is to love them. The best way to teach your kids discipline is to be disciplined. Just to give a simple example that's kind of nice and tangible. If you want your kids to grow up, valuing their health and well-being, then you need to live a way that values your health and well-being. So, you want them to see you exercising. You want them to see you eating healthy foods. It doesn't mean you can't enjoy some cake or chips every now and then.
Setting the example.
Setting an example. So that the most important thing we can do for our kids is to live the life we want them to live. Okay, because that's what they will copy it. They will learn most about life and how to live life by watching you, by observing you. Now, again, coming back to this idea that we're not perfect. That's still okay, because we still want it. One of the things we want to teach our kids is it's okay not to be perfect. It's okay to stuff up, and it's okay. It's especially okay if we learn from our mistakes. So, even though I said just a bit earlier that the best thing we can do is to live the good life and to show the behaviours we want our kids to learn. Part of that is actually showing them again that it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to make mistakes. But it's also important then to show them how we deal with that, how we bounce back from those things, because that's how they'll learn resilience.
So can we actually help them learn and make decisions?
Well, that's going to vary a bit depending on the age of the kids, I suppose. So, and this is it's a challenging thing talking about parenting, because parenting a baby or a toddler is different to parenting a teenager, which is different to parenting a young adult. So I guess that's the other qualifier I would say here is that we need to adapt our parenting as our children age.
Yeah.
That's really important. Yeah. And I'm guessing that, I'm not quite sure who's listening out there, but I'm guessing there'll be parents who have kids at all different ages. So that's important, and again, but I guess to go back to your question, when we're parenting very young babies or toddlers, we do need to be a bit more directive, a bit more prescriptive, I suppose, a bit more like a teacher saying, this is how you do it.
Yeah.
As they start to age, as they become preteens and teenagers, there's still a role for that. But what I would encourage parents to do is to start to be a bit more like a coach or a therapist, which is to say, to give them a bit more choice and to say, what do you think you can do? These are, help them explore all the various options. These are the various options. What are the pros and cons of the various options? And let them ideally choose the best option, guiding them more than telling them.
Yeah.
And then as they actually get older into sort of late teens and early adulthood, it's kind of more, then it becomes more about mentoring. They become their own person. They become a person who makes their own decisions. And then it's really about helping them, sharing advice, sharing wisdom or experiences. So again, it'll vary quite a bit. The other thing is we all have our own style. So, again, my parenting style will be different to yours. Mine's a bit different to my wife's. And it's not a matter that, it's not about one being better or worse than the other. But I suppose to be the best parent, we need to parent in our own way, in an authentic way, using our strengths. And again, that's it's going to vary from person to person. When it does come down to a couple, though, husband and wife or whatever, what is important is that even if you've got different styles, it is important to have consistent values or consistent messages or consistent priorities. Because if there's inconsistencies there, that can lead to confusion, which is not ideal for obvious reasons.
So as we're developing our own parenting skills, how do we help them build and develop their own sort of character?
It's important to look long term. So it's not just about little tricks there are little things you can do day to day, but character and resilience are things that develop over years and years, if not decades. So again, it comes down to what I said earlier about as a father, as a parent, what I would want and what I try to do, or what I've tried to do as best I can, is to illustrate, is to live examples of the sorts of things that I consider good character, and that I hope my children have observed, and sharing that with them. So things like honesty, and things like humility, or things like perseverance, or things like generosity, whatever it might be. We all have different values, and that's okay. So I suppose the first thing then is to clarify your values. What do you think is important when it comes to character? How can you live that? How can you display those behaviors to your children? Again, by sharing stories with them, telling them what you've done, and then by encouraging them to do it, helping and supporting them to do it, and reinforcing when you see them do it. So when you see your kid do something that you think is good, whatever that might be, so you see your kid bounce back from adversity, pick themselves up after they've fallen over, literally or metaphorically. Cheer them on, again, positively reinforcing desirable behavior. So if you see them, make a mistake, but then correct that mistake, cheer on the correction. Don't focus as much on the mistake. Focus more on what they've done to bounce back again. So, and it is doing that each and every day, looking for opportunities to learn and to teach, and doing that as best you can, as often as you can.
Yeah, I've started looking at everything now as an experience, or as a lesson that can be taught. Like, my days are completely changed now since doing this research, and looking at everything as a positive experience or a lesson to be learned. It makes you go out and find them experiences, or look for them lessons that sort of can be learned. A big one for me as well is how to build sort of trust between your child, because that's going to be a big one for me going forward. I want her to be able to trust me 100%. That if she needs to turn to someone, I want to be that person. And I think that's through effective communication, which you go into quite a lot in this series. How can we be effective communicators with our children?
Yeah, well, firstly, just to go back, that's an admirable goal, because arguably it's one of the most important goals as parents. Again, we know from the research, particularly, and I don't want to just focus on this, but particularly in those teenage years, which are, preteen and teenage years, which are, not always, but, the classic challenging years in some ways. But what we know is that even for those parents and teenagers who do face challenges, and we all do in different ways, one of, if not the most important things, is that trusting relationship. So that if your child gets into trouble, and, again, they all will to a greater or lesser extent, as you said, if they do get in trouble, what we want is for them to be able to come to us, because that's vitally important. And that doesn't just happen when times are difficult. You build that trust in the preceding days and weeks and years, really. Yeah. So that we should be building, as you've quite rightly said. Every parent, one of the most important goals we should have as parents is to build that trust from day one, or as soon as we can. So it comes from the little things. I mean, it comes from I think being vulnerable and open with your kids and admitting, for example, as a parent, talking to your kids about where you've made mistakes, so they feel it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah.
If I mean, not that I'd ever try this, or I certainly haven't, but if as a parent, if I'd tried to look perfect in front of my kids all the time, and that's kind of a bit of an old-fashioned approach. I think that's what parents probably did a bit in the past. They wanted to be the authoritarian and the perfect parent as best they could. They wanted to smile all the time, not show their kids are upset, and that was done well-meaning in the decades past, I suppose. But imagine if you're the kid seeing that, if you're the kid looking up saying, "Oh, my parent never gets anything wrong. My parent never gets upset." Yeah. How are they going to feel then? When they get upset, well, I can't talk to mum or dad because he or she doesn't understand. So, again, one of the first things we can do, and the most important things, is to be vulnerable, be authentic, to share with them our mistakes and our distresses, so they can see that that's because it is a normal part of life. The other really important thing is, and I hinted at this a bit earlier, is when they do stuff up, when they do make mistakes, when they do get things wrong, and they will, because they're children, because they don't know everything, because they're always learning. So, again, we should never expect our kids to get things right all the time. I mean, that's almost absurd.
No, especially when we're not either.
Exactly. So this is really important. So when they do get things wrong, we want to try not to get angry, try not to yell and scream, try not to show, be upset. We can be disappointed for them, but not disappointed for what's happened, but not upset in them. That's the difference. But again, so that because again, we want them to feel that if they do make mistakes, or when they make mistakes, we're still going to love them, and we're going to be there to support them, not just to yell or get angry with them. Yeah. So just the other little trick in there that can be really helpful. A simple tip is to separate the behaviour from the person. So when if my child does something wrong, I might be disappointed or upset with that behaviour, but I still love the person.
Yeah, okay. So we're finding sort of our way of building trust and being effective communicators. How do we set boundaries around that? How do we set healthy boundaries? Because I feel maybe us parents, we set strict boundaries sometimes out of pure protection for our kids. Would you mind talking about healthy boundaries, and also a study you spoke about in your series that ultimately taught us quite a lot?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating study. It goes back quite a few years now. I'll try and summarise it very briefly and then sort of explain the consequences. But so basically, it was a study that looked at parents and children, and there's two scenarios, I suppose. The first scenario is where the parents and the kids are set up in a big open space, in a big open park, and there's a central location, but the kids are told they can play anywhere, wherever they like. Go for it, basically, no holds barred. And then the second scenario is the same. It's set up so pretty much similar, but there's an artificial boundary that's created around the parents and the children. There's and the kids are told they can play wherever they like as long as they stay within that boundary. So pretty much the same situation, but one group's told just go for it, go wherever you like. The other group's told go for it, but within these within these lines. Now, interestingly, the second group who were given the boundaries, the kids actually explored further out than the other kids in the other group, and the conclusion is, or the assumption is, that they explored further because they felt safe having those boundaries. And now this is I'm oversimplifying this, cutting a long story short. But again, the principle is, which I think we can all learn, is that boundaries actually create freedom. By having rules for our kids, which they need to have, they actually feel safer, and our kids need to feel safe. So, boundaries, rules, whatever you want to call them, are actually a really important part of parenting. However, that being said, as I said a bit earlier, that will change as the kids age. So as our kids get older, we need to loosen that a bit more, give them a bit more freedom, allow them to make their own decisions, as they get through the teenage years to the latter teenage years. But still, the idea of having certain rules and regulations or disciplines is actually really important. Now, the other part of that, which you hinted at the beginning, I think, is that we all do this, but we often don't realise that we're doing it, or we don't realise why we're doing it. And the most common reason why we as parents set rules, and the rules we set, is because they're the rules we learnt from our parents.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And we do that unconsciously. We make rules. This is what I learned. This is how I grew up. So I don't even really think about it. This is what my kids are going to learn. Now that's okay. That makes sense. But it's actually not always helpful, because with all due respect, our parents weren't always perfect.
No.
I love my parents. They did the best they could. But the rules that they set weren't necessarily always ideal. And even if they were back then, they're not necessarily ideal for my kids. So I guess one thing we need to be wary of then, ideally, is to be mindful, is to try and pay attention to the rules we're setting and why we're, and then to stop and ask ourselves, just because I grew up like this, do my kids need to grow up like this? Just because my parents had these rules, do I need to set these rules? Now, sometimes the answer will be yes. Some of those rules are good rules and they're still valid and relevant, but sometimes they won't be. And, just to give you a really simple example, I grew up, my mother particularly came from a family, a fairly conservative family, and there were all sorts of rules about eating at the dinner table. And this is just a really simple example, but it can apply to anything else. And that's how we were brought up, and it was considered good manners to do certain things and bad manners to do. Now, some of those things are okay, but some of them are really they're just arbitrary. Like, who says you should use your knife and fork like this? Who says you... So I guess one of the things that I've encouraged people to think about is to be aware of those rules that we grew up with, to be aware of the rules that we might be making for our kids, and just to ask yourself, are they really necessary? Are they really helpful? Are they really... And if the answer is yes, then fine. But if the answer is no, maybe you can loosen them or change them or whatever. The big question is, what's helpful? Really, not what have we done for the last 20 or 30 years, but what's actually helpful for me, for my kids, how I want to parent, what I value, what's going to help them grow up to be the sort of person that and how important are these things? Some of the rules that we grew up with just aren't that important, really. So if they're not that important, do we really want to be banging on about them?
I don't think you could have said that any better. Right, look, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I greatly appreciate your time. And I look forward to upping my interviewing / podcasting skills and speaking with you again sometime. Thank you very much.
Yeah, keep up the good work. Thanks for doing what you're doing. Cheers, buddy.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Tim Sharp, giving us his thoughts from over 20 years of research. And he gives us such positive and simple direction. Lead by example. Please click the link below in the description to check out all of Dr. Sharp's amazing work. If you'd like to support the channel, the easiest way is to leave us a positive rating and review, and also share these episodes with your friends and family. It'd be greatly appreciated. And also interact with me on Instagram. I'd love to hear your thoughts, not just on the podcast, but parenting in general. Thanks again, and I'll see you all here again next week. Bye.